This is the third and final part in my video series on the Xeno franchise. Watch the first two to get caught up. I am not responsible if the things I say don't make sense to you otherwise. With the new CEO and the merger with Bandai, Namco as a company changed a lot, and with those changes came a soured relationship with Monolith Soft, who were now looking for a company to move to instead. And so, in 2007, Monolith publicly went from being a Namco developer to a Nintendo one. Around 2006, Takahashi had decided to move on from Perfect Works after the commercial failure of the Xeno Saga series, and came up with the idea for a game he would call Monado, Beginning of the World. And then Satoru Iwata came along and asked the title to be changed into Xenoblade in honor of Gears and Saga. Originally this wasn't going to mean anything, but little did anybody know at the time that this would have ended up getting the ball rolling for one of the most ridiculously insane returns I have ever seen. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, because before any of that could happen, the original Xenoblade released in 2010, with the subtitle Chronicles in the West. Whilst making these videos has made me come to appreciate Xenogears and Xenosaga a lot more than originally did, it also resulted in the opposite effect for the Xenoblade games. I by no means mean that the games are bad, for the most part at least, but I find them to be significantly more flawed than I originally did. So let's take it from the top and start with the beginning of the world. Once I separated Saga 1 and Reloaded, I'd like to open this segment by quickly discussing the three different versions of Xenoblade 1, as they do have their differences, and unlike Saga, there actually exists an optimal version to play. There's the Wii Original, the new 3DS version, and Definitive Edition. Aesthetically, the original is extremely distinct. Whereas every other game in the series is very clearly going for a sort of anime aesthetic, Xenoblade 1 goes for a much more Western-inspired look. It actually reminds me a bit of what Saga 2 was trying to do, except that it pulls it off much better. Personally, I like this aesthetic. Gameplay-wise, this version laid the groundwork for all the other Blade games, albeit having some pretty weird quirks of its own. For instance, you cannot jump while moving the camera. I don't know why, so don't ask me. I often see Xenoblade 3D get used as the butt of a joke because haha, there's no way the 3DS could handle that game, but honestly, they did a fantastic job of converting the game for the system. It is nearly identical to the original and honestly looks really good for a 3DS game, as long as you don't look at the characters' faces while they're a certain distance away from the camera. Barring the occasional frame drop and the worse audio quality, I cannot name a single reason why this version would in any way not be a serviceable version of the game to play. As for new features, it adds a sound test and a model viewer which are accessed through a roulette type system, and that's it. And lastly, there is Definitive Edition. As the name implies, this is far and away the best version of the game to play. It adds a shit ton of small quality of life improvements that seriously add up, as well as taking the formerly 80% non-Xeno game and retroactively slotting it into the Xeno franchise. We'll get into this later. It also replaces the art style with one that is significantly more anime inspired, which does make it fit in line with every other Xeno game, though I do find it loses a bit of the original's identity. So for the rest of the video, this will be the version I'll be focusing on. Xenoblade Chronicles was many people's first exposure to Xeno, and yet despite originally having absolutely nothing to do with Xeno, it still carries many of the fundamental themes in it. I'll get into this more in the story and characters section, so let's talk about the gameplay real quick. Whereas Gears and Saga were turn-based RPGs, Blade had the genius idea of turning the gameplay into a single-player MMO like FF12 did. Look, I like MMOs from time to time, but as a solo experience it just gets so boring. Essentially, you just stand around and watch your characters attack on their own until one of your special attacks finally recharges, before positioning yourself for its special effect, and then you repeat the process until you've won. Some arts are more effective, attacking from the side, some from behind, and so on, you get the idea. The issue is that they only recharge over time, so half the time in a battle, you're not doing anything at all. The only exception is whenever you're using a special art like Blossom Dance, or boosting the party gauge, which triggers a short QTE. There's like 3 things that are desperate to make it so you just don't zone off. The first is Shulk's visions. Every now and then during battles you can get a vision of the future. What this actually means is that you'll see the next attack is going to kill one of your party members. Now to save them, you can either use some of your party gauge to warn them of the incoming attack, or topple the enemy to pull the aggro towards you instead. The second is the Blade combos. The launch mechanic from Xenosaga 2 returns for some godforsaken reason, but with extra steps. Now certain arts can break an enemy, then another topples them, and then you cap it off with a daze to keep them down. Also similarly to Saga 2, these combos do a ridiculous amount of damage. And lastly you have the chain attacks. On the top of the screen you have this thing called the party gauge. It gradually fills up at the same way that the boost meters did in Saga, though their use is very different. You can either use one portion of the gauge to revive an ally, or you can wait until the entire thing is full to use a chain attack. If you do the latter, you can then choose one art to use per character, and after the third one you can do another QTE to be able to land a fourth hit. And depending on how well you're keeping the chain going, you can even get in a fifth and a sixth hit. And that's it. The game basically plays itself, and while I desperately wish I could say more, I just can't bring myself to do so. It is dreadfully boring. This is only made worse by the gem mechanic. Basically, you can craft these items that you can put onto your equipment that function kind of like the materia in FF7. Some of these are so extremely overpowered that you can easily decimate bosses without ever needing to touch a controller at all. Outside of combat, the way you explore the world has been changed dramatically. Gone is the level-esque structure of Saga and the classic square-styled world map of Gears. Instead, you can now seamlessly explore the entire world. It's semi-open world, if you will. Xenoblade 1 has one of my favorite settings out of any video game. The idea of exploring the corpses of these two giants perpetually locked in battle is genius to me, and the world really sells that feeling. From almost any place on the Beyonders, you can see the Mechonis' sword looming above you, and it seriously sells you on the world this game is creating. Even more impressive is that they've managed to make this work not just on the Wii but the 3DS as well. It helps that almost every location is extremely vibrant with iconic landscapes that are immediately recognizable. That is until you reach the Mechonis where everything looks the fucking same. But I digress. Probably to compensate for the world being this massive and open, they also added the ability to save anywhere, anytime, which is very much appreciated. With the gameplay out of the way, let's talk a bit about the audio side of things. Xenoblade 1 has quite possibly one of the best English dubs to any JRPG. It's so good that replaying the games in Japanese felt extremely wrong to me. Adam Howden absolutely kills it as Shulk, and generally the British accents of the cast fit the world pretty damn well. And then there's the music. Holy shit, the music's good. It's no secret that the series has generally had some pretty amazing soundtracks, but even amongst them, Xenoblade 1 is an outlier. Neither Kajiura nor Mitsuda were involved in this game. Instead, there were a variety of composers, namely Manami Kiyota, the music production trio Ace Plus, and Yoko Shimomura. Probably due to it not being a Xeno game until the later stages of production, most of the music doesn't follow the traditions set by the previous games. While it is there in some songs, the Celtic influence is nowhere near as prevalent as in Gears or Saga, and especially Shimomura's tracks feel extremely out of place for the series. Now don't get me wrong, I love her work, I'd argue most people do, and this game is no exception, but it really doesn't sound like a Xeno soundtrack most of the time. This is only made worse by the remastered soundtrack in the Definitive Edition. Now, full disclosure, you can freely swap between the original and remastered tracks at any time. However, the remastered tracks are just flat out worse. I don't know how to really put it, but most of the tracks just try to sound too epic, I suppose. It loses a lot of the bombastic energy the original soundtrack had, a good example being An Obstacle in Our Path. That aside, the music is still all around fantastic. Since exploring this massive world is such a major part of the game, having these longer, much more relaxed tracks accompanying the exploration is a very welcome decision. In Gears and Saga 1 especially, the area music was generally pretty short, which could very quickly get irritating, and thankfully that is no longer an issue. For as much shit as I have given the game, it is a genuinely extremely enjoyable experience to just walk across the Beyonders seeing these beautiful landscapes accompanied by the soundtrack, which really helps set the mood and reminds you that this isn't some insane space epic about the meaning of life or whatever, but an adventure about people trying to get by in a world that kinda wants everyone dead. Until you get to the second half of the game and all of a sudden it becomes a Xeno game, which is an experience only made more visceral by the changes in Definitive Edition, retroactively fitted into the game for the sake of properly making it a part of the larger Xeno narrative. For reasons that will become apparent later, I'll keep talking about the story segments to the spoiler section of the video at the end. However, let's talk about the characters. Now, since this was originally not a Xeno game, there are some characters who don't particularly fit into a pre-established archetype, however, most very much do belong to one or another, be it coincidentally or not. Shulk is very clearly this game's contact, though whereas literally every other one is reluctant to fight and does it more so to protect others, Shulk is out for blood, fueled almost entirely by revenge for most of the game, and also he's robo-racist. And if this sounds like it's going into the direction of a different archetype as well, keep that to yourself for now. He also takes the form of the Yuzuki archetype. by virtue of his know-how with machines. Ryan is the story's Fatima, serving as a comedic wingman to the contact capable of being serious when needed. Fiora is the antitype combined with the Kazim. Dunban is the Uzuki and the Banderas stand-in, serving as both a mentor and the voice of reason and calm judgment of the party. Melia is the Magus, Charla is the gunslinger, and Riki is the Antichrist. And while I would love to say that every single one of them is extremely likable and as well fleshed out as their Saga counterparts, I simply can't. Charla and Riki could be written out of the story entirely, and barring a scene or two, barely anything would need to be changed. And Melia gets barely enough screen time to do anything of note. Her entire arc revolves more around the people who shaped her than it does about herself. They tried to mitigate this in Future Connected, but we'll talk about how that worked out, or rather didn't, once we get to that game. I can respect that they actually tried to make Charla more relevant again later on in the story, but it is an attempt that does kind of fall flat if you ask me, as it is genuinely the only time she ever gets relevant after she joins the party. Likewise, Melia is a very important character, but only thanks to the people around her, and I genuinely wish they'd done more with her as an actual character. The characters in general really are a big reason why the game is so fondly remembered, and rightly so, because the ones that do actually get fleshed out really shine, which is only strengthened by the heart-to-hearts. Every now and then in the world you come across spots where the characters will be able to take a break and just talk with one another, often unrelated to the main story, but it helps flesh them out as more than just characters in a play. It helps make even the underutilized party members like Riki feel like an actual part of the world, and it genuinely makes me wish that some of these were a part of the main story as well. All around, I do like Xenoblade, I really do. Or at least I like most aspects of it. I really like the music, I really like the world, the characters, the story, but actually playing through the game is a genuine chore. I wouldn't even mind it as much if the gameplay part of things involved more than the occasional QTE. As we'll see later on, this will get better, but this is still the basis of all games that follow. So while on one hand I can't say I actually like playing the game, there's still a damn good reason for why it became a cult classic in the first place. And because it wouldn't be a Xeno game without one, Xenoblade 2 ended up receiving its own perfect works. As per usual, this book contains a shit ton of world building, concept art, character information, a glossary, and even a collection of the scripts to most of the heart-to-hearts in the game. I highly recommend reading this if you like the original game and would like to learn more about what went into its creation. In spite of its niche status, Xenoblade 1 sold pretty fucking well all things considered, and so Takahashi and his team decided it was time to return to full-on sci-fi. They gave themselves several guidelines when first creating this game, such as minimizing the amount of time the players spent bored. They also wanted to make sure to encourage active criticism, as, I quote Takahashi here, "After Xenoblade Chronicles was released, there weren't all that many negative opinions that he encountered online. Take that in whatever way you will." 3 years of development later, and the world was given Xenoblade X. Many people like to describe this game as a single-player MMO, and you know what? That couldn't be any more true. This is simultaneously the game's greatest strength and biggest weakness. The world is gigantic, I'm talking 5 times the size of Xenoblade 1's world, which was already pretty damn massive. And one of the biggest selling points of the game was that you were said to be able to explore this entire world while piloting your very own customizable mech. I have to come clean and admit something here, I don't like open world games very much, which is to say they bore me. However, a world as massive as XPX's would have been perfect for online play. Imagine exploring all of these locales and running into other players along the way, helping out in fights and having a great time with friends. The game already plays just like a traditional MMO after all. You have your own fully customizable character and the gameplay was left pretty much unchanged from the first game. However, they did remove chain attacks. You have a run button now, fights are ever so slightly faster in pace, and there's approximately 10% more QTEs for arts than there were before. Hell, in this game you even automatically respawn after 30 seconds when you die instead of just being sent back to the last checkpoint or autosave or whatever. Now, Final Fantasy XII has essentially the same kind of combat system, but so do FF11 and 14, both of which being actual MMOs, so adding a multiplayer component to XPX seems like a no-brainer, right? I'd think so at least. And it does in fact have a multiplayer component. However, it comes with an ever so slight teeny weeny really major issue. You can only do select squad missions online. There's no meeting random players in the world, no progressing the story with your friends, just you, your nameless avatar, and a world that is an absolute chore to explore, for reasons we'll get into shortly. Now I love games like Phantasy Star Online, even in an offline single player environment, however the reason why those games work, even on your own, is the way missions are structured. Xenoblade X is as if you've taken Final Fantasy XIV with triple the map size and absolutely none of the player interaction. A large part as to why MMOs are so popular is the ability to get together with friends and play through a story together, being able to help each other out during it and experiencing it at the same time. Another is the constant stream of player interaction. A world as big as this one simply needs people running around it to make it feel lived in. Now I understand that Mira is a desolate and hostile planet and that humans are simply trying to survive there. But it doesn't make the world any less tedious to explore. And now it's time to talk about why. Remember that awesome mech the entire game was advertised around? Now this game has a total of 12 chapters. You don't get your mech, or skell as they call it in game, until after chapter 6. Past what the game itself considers to be its halfway point, and after that you don't get to fly in it until doing a side quest only available after chapter 9. Assuming you do this, you get a total of 3 story chapters where you can actually explore the world as it was advertised, and you know what? It's fun. It's really fucking fun. Being able to fly from point A to point B is fucking awesome, yet you're busy spending more than 70% of the game walking or driving around on land. What doesn't help is that the camera flat out fucking sucks. It's extremely slow and irritating even on the fastest setting. The controls are also just really weird. On-foot movement feels super slippery and awkward, and it's especially bad when driving around in a skell. There's like a really noticeable delay between pressing the button and letting go of it in anything outside of combat, and the character actually reacting to it. But enough about complaining about the gameplay. For now, let's do something I won't do for any other game in the series and have a talk about the story for a bit, or rather, the lack thereof. Now, I'm not saying that there is none at all, but it is an extremely messy affair. So from the top, as per usual with Xeno, Earth is just gone now, and so instead the entire game takes place on an alien planet known as Mira, where the only city to ever have contributed to humanity's peanut economy in a substantial way has decided to rebuild human civilization. Los Angeles. Yeah, and honestly for the most part that is it. You play as Cross, a man gifted with a unique power. He can jump higher than any white person ever recorded in history. There are some interesting parts to the story, but I'll keep what's relevant to the spoiler section. But truth be told, it is extremely inconsequential. The best way I can describe this game's plot is all setup, no payoff. It reminds me a lot of the way Xenosaga 1's story played out, especially since the game ends on not 1 but 2 cliffhangers, to which we'll likely never get an answer to. Again, more on that in the spoiler section. Where Saga 1 had a pretty substantial cast of characters that helped flesh out the world and story, Blade X has like 3 characters of note, and Cross isn't even one of them by virtue of being a nameless, faceless self-insert. There are a shit ton of other characters you could theoretically recruit, and they do get a bit of personality in their respective affinity quests, but outside of that, they may as well not exist. Same with large parts of the story and world building. The majority of it is relegated entirely to side quest content, and that leads me to what is far and away my biggest problem with this game. The main story progression system is absolute fucking garbage. At almost every single part of the main story, the game will just roadblock you from taking the next story mission until you meet a certain set of requirements, and those can range anywhere from fill out this much percentage of this part of the map and do this specific side quest to collect this much of item X and please max out this specific character's skill tree on your main character. It's tedious, it's frustrating, and most of all, it's wasting my fucking time. If you would, at the very fucking least, let me do the side quests with friends, then it wouldn't even be so bad, but nope, you're on your own, bucko, have fun. The early game is fucking awful and the mid game is only slightly better, but still not all too fun. But the end game, and especially the post game, are really fucking fun. Once you've cleared the story and have all the options available, you can have a great time, because you're not being held back by arbitrary bullshit roadblocks anymore. For instance, there's this class system where you can select one of several progressive jobs, all with their own weapons and playstyles, grouped into attack, defense, and support. No healers this time, because Takahashi allegedly thought people would find playing as a healer fucking boring, but I digress. In the main campaign, you're somewhat encouraged to experiment with the different classes and try out as many as you want, but because of how awfully tedious progression in the story can be, it's not exactly ideal. In the post-game though, none of these restrictions apply and you're free to play whatever class you feel like and just drop it at any time without coming to regret it 4 missions later. I genuinely love how fun the post-game can be sometimes, and I can definitely see how some MMO fanatics could end up spending hundreds upon hundreds of hours in it just for fun. But man, the actual road to getting there can be downright nightmarish sometimes. Aesthetically speaking, we've dropped the Western-inspired style of Xenoblade 1 and returned to a more anime-esque style, which fits far more in line with the other games in the series, helped by the fact that Kunihiko Tanaka returned as the character designer, with Choco coming back to the mech design, just like it was back in Saga 1 and 2. And you can call me biased, but I think the game looks good. I know the character models get clowned on a lot, but I genuinely think that a lot of the environments can be downright gorgeous, even rivaling some areas in the other Blade games. And then there's the music. If there ever was anything controversial in the Blade series, it's the music in X. And you know what? I'll say it the way it is, the music in this game is fucking awesome. None of the prior game's composers were involved with this one, and even Takahashi took a step back and let the composer do his own thing entirely. Said composer being Hiroyuki Sawano. He seems to be a pretty big deal in the anime music industry, but I don't know the first thing about that. But what I do know is that his music in this game is fucking awesome. I know I'm saying this for 2 games in a row, but this soundtrack is unlike anything else in the franchise. Almost all of it consists of these loud and bombastic industrial tracks, though never forgetting the Xeno signature Celtic influence when apt. What sets this soundtrack apart from all the others in the series is the fact that most of the songs here have lyrics, not just a credits theme. Mind you, none of the lyrics are written by Takahashi, and they can get delightfully fucking stupid, but some of them are also just straight up fucking beautiful. Songs like Uncontrollable rival some of the best tracks in the franchise. So if you're one of those frankly stupid people who turned off the music volume while playing the game, I implore you to give the OST a listen outside of the game sometime. Ignore the lyrics and just enjoy the music for what it is. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. I'll also be linking some of my personal favorite tracks in the description. That, however, sums up about everything I have to say about Xenoblade X. A game that can be as frustrating as it can be fun, and simultaneously test your patience until it reaches the brink. And yet I'll take that experience any day over what the world was made to witness 2 years later. I know I called Xenosaga 2 the worst Perfect Works game, but Xenoblade 2 is far and away my least favorite. I apologize in advance if this segment devolves into a lot of complaining. History repeating itself has always been a main theme throughout these games, so I find it particularly funny that the Blade and Saga series parallel each other so much. The first game was completely uncharted territory for the team, and the result ended up being pretty decent, albeit very flawed. Then for the second game, Takahashi decided to take hands-off approach, whilst the smaller team, in this case of 40 people, worked on it actively, and that resulted in an absolute mess. But you know what? Before this devolves into a rant, let's talk about what this game does well, because they certainly do exist, namely the combat. Fundamentally speaking, the game plays much better than the original. Whilst the core ideas are still intact, arts now recharge depending on how many auto attacks you land, as opposed to simply recharging over time. Your characters also now consist of pairs of a driver and a blade, with the driver deciding the base stats and affinities, and the blade deciding the moveset. You can bring up to 3 blades per driver into battle, and you can swap them out at any time once their cooldown is over. To compensate for this, you can now only equip up to 3 arts per blade, now mapped to the respective face buttons. And the talent art is always blade specific. Not only does this streamline the game by a lot, but it also makes it significantly less annoying than having to cycle through every art with the D-pad. If you use your talent arts right, you can now also put elemental orbs onto enemies, which you can then break during chain attacks by using the opposite element, which deals insane damage, and if you kill an enemy during a chain attack and beat their shit in some more, you get overkill, which is functionally identical to finish strikes from Saga 3. And you know what? I'm not gonna bother explaining the combat more, because this actually leads me to my first complaint with this game. There are an insane amount of tutorial pop-ups all the way to the end of the game, and yet despite that, the game fails at teaching you any of its mechanics properly. There's a damn good reason why the average length of a Xenoblade 2 combat explanation on YouTube is about 10 fucking minutes long. This is the exact same problem that Saga 2 had. Lots of tutorials for an overly complicated system, but nothing is actually explained. And that really sucks, because once you understand the systems that the game has, it can be really fucking fun. Or, well, it could. The reason why it isn't is because nothing in the main game at any point ever encourages you to actually play with the mechanics, because just a handful of orb break chains are enough to completely decimate every single enemy. It isn't even until you reach the post-game content like the level 100 plus super bosses or the challenge battles that you actually get to play with the mechanics of the game. But you know what? Since we're already here, let's talk about what is quite possibly the biggest fucking sin this game commits. Do you all know what a gacha is? I've talked about them before in the Phantasy Star videos, but basically it's a system commonly used in mobile games, where you use an in-game currency to randomly roll for new characters to use. And for some godforsaken reason, Monolith decided that that's a system that the game definitely needed. The drop rates are completely demented, and the system is tied to the only other system in this game bad enough to rival it. Fucking field skills. This is one of the worst game mechanics ever invented. Every now and again, the game will just arbitrarily roadblock you somewhere and skill check you on the abilities of your currently equipped blade. Let's take Pyra. Pyra's element is fire, so she has fire field skills, and you can use them to fucking cook or burn down the path, right? Well, no. Not unless you deal with the completely stupid affinity system to level up their skills to the necessary system. Raising a blade's affinity involves giving them their favorite food, using them in battle, sucking them off, or gaslighting them with a DLC item, which basically instantly raises their affinity to maximum. Because this is a pay-to-win game. We'll get to this later. Now, sometimes these skill checks demand you to use skills that your current story blades don't have. So you're forced to grind core crystals to roll for random blades, hoping you get one that has what you need. Easily unlockable, so you can progress. This is the most insulting form of padding. All it does is waste your time. And since we're at it, let's talk about the blades for a bit. There's basic blades of all types and elements there to do nothing but waste your time and fill out the pool of uselessness, this game loves to fly around. The important ones are the rare blades, which are actually named characters. They get their own side quests and backstory and have unique skills and abilities that actually make them worth using, and these are a perfect showcase of what is easily the biggest problem of this game's visuals. It's not the insane amount of texture popping, nor is it the fact that the game is basically unplayable in handheld mode, it's the insane art style clash prominent all over the fucking game. There were a total of 27 character designers for this game. The main party was designed by Masatsugu Saito, and the main antagonist group by Tetsuya Nomura. And you know what? If it makes Takahashi happy to finally work with Nomura after all these years, then fine, but those two should have been enough. But nope, because every other blade was designed by one of the other 25 people. Now, this did lead to a couple of cool things. For instance, Soraya Saga designed one of them, which makes this the first and only time she's worked on the series since Saga 2. However, what's really cool is that they decided to put characters from older Xeno games in. Kunihiko Tanaka came back to redesign KOS-MOS, giving her the worst design she's ever had. Though, he also came back to design Elma, Shulk, and Fiora in the DLC. Meanwhile, Choco redesigned Telos, giving her Shion's old glasses, and I highly approve of this. Just a small issue though, they also designed all new blades. Choco's designs are actual shit, and I refuse to elaborate, I think you can see them. But Tanaka ended up drawing a choo-choo, but a bird. And that's a fact that I've lost sleep over, but I digress. So why did I call this game pay to win? Well, the DLC introduced several new blades, and all of them are completely overpowered to the point where they could easily solo the game. I just want to point out that the strongest character in this game was designed by the Sword Art Online artist. Make of this what you will. The DLC also introduced the Love Potion, which can easily be crafted and completely negates the need to grind for affinity points. How fun! With the combat out of the way, let's talk about the world a bit. Instead of the massive world of Xenoblade 1, Alrest is split into several smaller locations, probably to compensate for the fact that the team have no fucking idea how the Switch's hardware works. These still have some extremely pretty cool landmarks, and it's very cool seeing the Titans move in the distance, but ultimately a lot of them just aren't nearly as interesting as much of what the Bionis or even areas in Blade X had to offer, even though you can tell that the team tried their hardest. The Sea of Clouds is especially cool. Instead of being an instant death zone, it actually lets you swim around, though falling into it with no teleporting location nearby can be pretty annoying. And then there's the dungeons. I really don't like them. A lot of them simply involve going from point X to point W to get item Z to activate mechanism Y at point X, and you do this like 3 times per dungeon. It's lazy, and I'd really rather have something like the open exploration of Blade 1 or the occasional puzzles of Saga 3. Now that I've complained your ears off about the gameplay, let's talk about the characters and story for a bit, alright? This game has by far the slowest opening in the series. You start off with this beautiful shot of the Sea of Clouds, but that barely lasts and doesn't even get you immediately hooked like the Eldritch Crash in Gears or the Battle of Sword Valley in Blade. Granted, Saga 1's opening was also very slow, and then for the solid next hour you just run around doing chores and getting prepared for your job doing a boring QTE minigame. It's really like nothing happens, and it kind of sets the tone for everything to come. You can really tell that each chapter was written by a different writer, and the story has a lot of moments where the characters just run around doing something completely arbitrary to pad out the runtime. I can't name the amount of time until chapter 7, where the current main story objective simply involves running around to an arbitrary location for what really should have been a side quest. But then you get to the final few chapters actually written by Takahashi, and all of a sudden the game gets good, and it's almost enough to make everything worth it. It makes me wish that the entire game was like that. And then there's the characters. Horrible character designs aside, I really don't like this cast. Rex is by far the most unlikable contact in the series. I get that he's supposed to be this immature kid who has to grow up, but his journey is just not compelling, and he comes across as annoying more than anything else. Pyra and Mithra are both antitype and complement, as well as the Kasim for reasons I'll discuss more later. Nia is also the antitype and Kasim combined, but she also has a bit of the Magus in her. Morak takes the mentor role of the Yuzuki and the stoicism of the Menderes, with an importance to the story as grand as Timothy from Gears. Zeke is literally just Bart mixed with Sigurd, even his DLC alt color is just straight up Bart. He's the only good character in this party, because I'm biased. And then lastly there is Tora. I wish to see Tora boiled alive until the flesh melts off his skin. I don't know who had the idea to make this game's choo-choo equivalent a lolicon weeb, but whoever they are, I want them fired this fucking instant. What does not help is that he is the strongest driver in the game bar none. If you build Poppy's final form, whose name I refuse to say, right, she becomes a fucking killer machine that can solo super bosses even while severely underleveled. All it takes is some hours of grinding, one of the worst minigames, no, scratch that, the worst minigame in the franchise. Tiger, Tiger. If you like this minigame, we cannot be friends. On the villain side, I'd for now like to focus on two characters. Malos is basically this game's Graph equivalent, and he steals the show every scene he's in. His English voice actor is hilarious. The dude just shows up sometimes, fucks shit up, swears, and leaves. The other is Jin. Not only does he take his name from Jin Uzuki, but he's essentially just an inversion of Jin mixed with some parts of Margulis. And in spite of the fact that he so blatantly rips off many aspects of Jin Uzuki, he fails to make them work. His story fundamentally misunderstands what makes Saga's Jin so compelling. And whilst he is still one of the best characters in this game, he ends up feeling like little more than a shallow copy. For now, that's as far as I'm willing to talk about the story outside of the spoiler section, so we'll definitely get back to this later. If nothing else, the music is fucking beautiful. Yasunori Mitsuda has returned to the franchise and is here to stay, as one of the composers as well as one of the soundtrack producers, and thanks to him, things like the Celtic influence are back in full force, and you know what? Sometimes that is enough to just make me forget that I'm playing Xenoblade 2, as I simply sit back and get immersed in the atmosphere. Xenoblade 2 is one of my least favorite types of games, the it gets good eventually variety, because whilst the first several chapters are atrocious, the final few really are good enough to make it almost all worth it. I'll get back to all of this in the spoiler section though, so for now it's time to move on. Though we're not reaching Xenoblade 3 just yet. As part of the DLC campaign, Xenoblade 2 would end up getting a completely standalone prequel game, and that game kinda fucking rules. I love Torna the Golden Country. It's like a bite-sized version of everything Blade 2 does well, with all the bad parts removed. The combat, for instance, is largely the same. However, the Blades are now proper characters. Your party consists of 3 teams, each with 1 driver and 2 Blades. Of the 2 Blades, only 1 can be used in active battle, but you can still swap them out like in a base game. Unlike there though, you can now actually play as them with their own unique movesets and everything. The passive character in your party gets to attack from behind too, meaning you essentially have an active party of 6 now. Furthermore, the gacha bullshit is completely gone, so you can focus all of your efforts on building the few party members you actually have. This is far and away my favorite combat system in the Blade series, and partly why I like this game so much. Even the roughest of edges in Blade 2 were sanded down, considerably. Field skills, for instance, no longer arbitrarily block your progress, and thank God for that. They also modified the engine so that texture popping in the game is considerably less noticeable than in base game. Art style clash is also no longer a problem since everything actually looks consistent now. Whilst some areas from XP2 do return, namely Gormod, most of the game takes place on the completely new continent of Torna, and man I love this place. It's extremely fucking pretty and full of memorable landmarks like in Blade 1, with the capital especially setting itself apart by having this clearly Eastern inspired aesthetic. I also adore how the soundtrack for this game gives everything a certain jazz flair. It works incredibly well and results in what is easily one of my favorite OSTs in the franchise. Since the game is also much shorter than the average Blade game, this run for instance took me about as long as Xenosaga 2, it results in a short but very sweet experience. But as always, the game does have one major problem. At 2 points in the story, you'll be stopped dead in your tracks until you've reached a certain community level. The first time you get roadblocked until reaching level 2, and the second time requires level 4 to progress. The way you increase the community level is through interacting with NPCs and primarily doing side quests. I for one found these to be really enjoyable, but there's no denying that it seriously kills the pace, and some people would really rather just continue on with the story. I think what really carried this system for me was that I honestly really love these characters. Unlike with base Blade 2, I found the party to be great. As always, everyone fits into the classical Xeno archetypes, though for reasons I'll be discussing later in the spoiler segment, this is where these archetypes start to become a little iffy, so just bear with me for now. Laura is a wonderful protagonist and is not the game's contact. It's nice to have someone fresh holding the reins again, and her energetic point of view is really nice. The actual contact this time around is Adam, though he also has a lot of Bart in him. Mithra's still the anti-type mixed with the Kasim, and Jin's still the Uzuki. Minov takes over as a gunslinger, Hugo is a noble and easily the weakest of the cast, Bridget serves as a good magus, and Hayes is the game's Chucho equivalent, except she's really adorable. And before someone asks, no, I didn't forget Aegeon, the game did. Really, the cast consists of pretty much just Laura, Jin, Adam, and Mithra. That's all you really need. The relationships between these 4 characters are fantastic, and seeing them bounce off of the rather simple rest of the cast is an absolute joy. It's why I really enjoyed doing the side quests and why I didn't mind 100%ing the game. All around, I found Torna to be an excellent game, and I really can't help but wish this is what the base game had been like too. But what can you do? You win some, you lose some. Before we move on to Xenoblade 3, let's first go back to the first game and talk about the side story added in the Definitive Edition, Future Connected. This is an epilogue story to the main game, set approximately a year after it. The only party members to return are Shulk and Melia, though you're accompanied by an army of Napon and two of Riki's children who take their movesets from Ryan and Charla respectively. Gameplay-wise, this game's nearly identical to Xenoblade 1, but the only noteworthy differences are that there are no more visions, and that chain attacks are replaced with the Napon army beating the ever-living shit out of your enemies. I don't really have much to say about this one outside of the story stuff in the spoiler section, to be honest. Most of the game takes place on the Baroness's shoulder, which is a cut location from the first game, and that is really cool, but it's also pretty boring. Basically nothing happens here. Shulk was flanderized quite a bit, because he shouldn't be here to begin with, and now he's just the tech guy. And Melia's role in the story is completely underutilized. Whilst the few noteworthy things that do happen are pretty cool, they are very few and far between. Though to be fair, the thing is barely 7 hours long. I still can't help to wish there was a bit more to it though. Sure, it's cool that some side quests follow up on ones from the main game, and the music is as usual fantastic. Like holy shit, the Fog Beast battle theme is amazing. But ultimately this side story serves more as a setup for even more setup in Xenoblade 3. But with that serving as a perfect transition, I'd say it's about time we move on. On the day that I am recording this, it has been exactly 1 year since Xenoblade 3 was first released. Since then, I've seen opinions change on it drastically. Whilst I can definitely see why the game ended up getting much more criticism down the line as opposed to at launch, I still firmly stand by the belief that this is not only the best of the main Xenoblade trilogy, but one of the best Xeno games period. Once again, let's start with the gameplay changes, since Blade 3 is supposed to be a combination of 1 and 2. It makes sense that they'd make the gameplay be a follow-up of the same theme. During combat, you now have two types of arts, ones that refill over time, like in Blade 1, and ones that refill with each hit, like in 2. Talent arts, on the other hand, still function like in 2, where things get really interesting is in its unique mechanics. Whereas the first game lets you equip up to 8 arts and 2 only let you have 3 per blade, 3 lets you set up 6 of them, whereas 3 are mapped to the face buttons and the other 3 to the D-pad. Your party is also split into 3 pairs, all of which can then fuse into Ouroboros form, which are this game's gear equivalents. Yep, they're back. More on this later. Once the form is charged up, you can turn into it. Basically, this is a temporary super mode where you get a set moveset with whatever passives you've unlocked. You can take damage while in Ouroboros form, however, it gradually heats up, so you want to make sure to dish out as much damage as possible while in this form, especially because of something we'll get into shortly. The other big change is chain attacks. Gone is the weird orb bullshit from 2. Instead, you try to keep a chain going as much as you can by using your party's unique passives, certain skill effects, and the 3 different job categories, all of which can be affected by certain equipment. And if you're in Ouroboros form while starting it, you can cap the chain attack off with a fat Ouroboros combo attack that dishes out some extremely beefy damage. Combine this with the topple, launch, smash combos, and you can deal some ludicrous amounts of damage. Trust me when I say that you'll definitely need that. Again, more on this in a bit. This is far and away the best chain attack system in the series, especially since Overkill returns. And then there's by far my favorite system they added, jobs. I'm talking Final Fantasy V type jobs. I'm a massive sucker for these systems, so I may just be biased, but it can't be helped. There's healers, tanks, attackers, buffers, debuffers, healers that do damage, attackers with an elemental focus, tanks that are borderline immortal. You get the idea. Furthermore, every job comes with an associated character who joins your party as a hero. Heroes are essentially an additional 7th party member you can tag along, and they range anywhere from completely overpowered to absolutely useless. And just like in FF5, leveling up a job on a certain character allows them to permanently gain moves and passives associated with that job. Fundamentally, this is a really good combat system. So then why is it that bosses are the biggest fucking damage sponges in the franchise? The amount of damage they take to go down is fucking ridiculous sometimes. Field skills are also entirely gone, thank fuck. Instead, you now get abilities throughout the game that gradually allow you to explore more of the world. And my god is it big. Every location is extremely full of iconic landmarks and absolutely beautiful views. Since the world is a combination of the ones from the first 2 games, many of their landmarks are still here, now decrepit and desolate, but very much recognizable. The Mechonis' sword, looking as if it was striking the Orion Titan, is easily one of the most iconic visuals in the game, and the sword is visible from just about anywhere on the map, just like the Mechonis itself was on Bionis. Initially I was worried that progressing in the world might end up being extremely tedious like a lot of times on 2, where sometimes I'd just be walking around for hours looking for the next objective as the obvious path is arbitrarily roadblocked. Thankfully, they remedy this by giving you the Dead Space Where the fuck do I go button. That just shows you the fastest possible path to your next active objective. Xenoblade X had something similar, but pretty annoying to use. Thanks to this, exploration is extremely enjoyable, and you never have to worry about getting lost, and can just take in the excellently designed world at your leisure. Before we continue, I'd also like to point out that the soundtrack is fucking fantastic. Mitsuda is back as a key composer and is spearheading the music production, and it really shows. The game's soundtrack is significantly more somber than the other games in the series, reminiscent of Saga 3, and whilst a lot of people have considered it to be more boring than the others because of that, I can't help but disagree. I think the soundtrack is very fitting to the overall tone of the game and really helps to enhance some of its best moments. Hell, even the art style of this game is great. The way Saito designed the characters has mellowed out considerably since Blade 2, and the entire game has a sort of brushstroke aesthetic, and it works extremely well for the Switch. So the gameplay is great, the visuals are great, the music is great, so what is it about this game that people don't like? Well, the answer is easy. See, the game has 7 chapters to its story, and the first 5 are fucking fantastic. However, the story starts to slow down dramatically in the later half, and to a lot of people this is where the game falls off. I'll go into details in the spoiler section, but they're not wrong per se. A lot of loose ends are simply either ignored or completely forgotten about, and unlike Saga 3 where all arcs are resolved and only the future is uncertain, I simply can't say that that's the case here either. I do believe that Blade 3 is a lot smarter than most people give it credit for, but a lot of the criticism is warranted. Again, more on this in the spoiler segment. So while we're at it, let's talk about the characters for a bit. There's always a peace-loving protagonist forced to fight to protect those he cares about, who also suffers from some very clear mental health problems. Their emotional counterpart, who is also just as psychologically screwed, the man who knows a little bit more about the world than most do, hot-headed bronze of the party, teenager with a firearm, the Furby, and lastly, the always composed strong guy with a heart of gold and some serious trauma to process. The story takes place in the middle of a war between 2 warring nations called Kiev and Agnes, and the main antagonists are a group of masked individuals working under an elusive leader towards an unclear goal, whilst perpetuating said war. And if any of this is giving you a feeling of déjà vu, well, it's you and me both. This game is a celebration of everything Xeno, and I don't mean that just for Blade. I know this is going to sound extremely pretentious, but I genuinely think that if you've played Xenogears, you'll get way more out of this game than if you've played the other Blade games. Hell, I'd call it a legally distinct remake. Though, it's also much more than that. More on this in the spoiler section. The entire game is full of nothing but reverence and love for everything Takahashi has built. A good spoiler-free example of this would be the Ouroboros forms. Being designed by series veteran Choco, you can already imagine them being full of references. Noah's is based on the Weltall, Mio's on KOS-MOS V3, Uni's on Crescens, Senna's on Dina, and so on. And you know what? Maybe I'm just reading into things, but with everything I've seen from the series so far, I find that hard to believe. No, this game was meticulously designed for fans of the series as a whole. Or at least, that's what it feels like to me. It's not perfect by any means. Trust me, I have just as many problems with the game's ending portion as most people. Nor is it even remotely as masterfully written as Saga or as ambitious as Gears. But behind the game is a clear passion for the Xeno series, and that alone is enough to make it my favorite of the Xenoblade main games. But this isn't where the story ends, nor is this my favorite Xenoblade game in general, because this game's DLC is what finally validates this entire journey through the franchise. Future Redeemed is good. Really good. This is hands down the most refined package out of any Blade game. Gameplay wise it's obviously based on Blade 3, though some changes do exist. For one, heroes and jobs are gone and the Ouroboros forms were replaced by partner attacks. Said partner attacks are also the only way to finish off a launch combo now, as opposed to regular arts. That's it for combat changes really, but holy shit, exploration has never been better. In this game, to upgrade your characters you need to use exploration points, or I guess they're called affinity points, which you get by doing just about anything really. Picking up items across the map, finding landmarks, fighting enemies, you actually get rewarded for exploring every nook and crevice for once, as opposed to just finding some rare items or enemies. It's extremely satisfying. A good example of how good this change is the Collectopedia. It's a thing that was in both Xenoblade 1 and X, where if you get all the collectible items in an area, you get a certain reward, like gear or money. In Xenoblade 3, the weird NPC-specific bullshit where some NPCs request you get them some certain items or whatever, and the reward is honestly not worth it. Here on the other hand, you get the skill points that alone makes it a million times more useful. And even outside of this, you're rewarded for your exploration, as you can sometimes find different kinds of kits that unlock special passes for your character pairs, more parts of your skill trees, and so on. And since the game is about as long as Torna, it's actually really fucking fun to 100% it, as crazy as that may sound. But really, the gameplay isn't what you should be playing this game for, the story is. Xenoblade 3 may have been a celebration of everything Xeno, but Future Redeemed is the final nod to everything that makes up perfect works. This is the end of the story as we know it. This game doesn't just tie its own narrative up perfectly, but it finally gives us answers that I've been waiting for over a decade. I'm really getting ahead of myself here, so this is where we're calling it quits for the spoilerless part of the video. From this point onwards, there will be massive spoilers. This spoiler section will be split in two. The first will focus on some spoiler portions for just the Xenoblade games that I've been wanting to talk about. The second, on the other hand, will feature spoilers for not just all of Blade, but the entire franchise. And Future Redeemed sits right in the center of everything. So, for everyone who's hopping off the video now, please play these games. All of them. Then come back here. I promise you that it's all worth it. For everyone else, let's raise the curtain on the final act of this, frankly, too long play. Before we get into trying to tie everything together, let's just talk about the individual Blade games for a bit. For Xenoblade 1, I like the story, I do. I think the characters are really strong, but I certainly do have issues with it. For instance, there's a side story in the secret file where they explain how Fiora got her Holmes body back. I think that should have just been in the main game. On that note, I think it's a damn shame how they treat Melia. Up until the party saves Fiora, she's supposed to be the main female lead, but they kind of never capitalize on it. This is only made worse by the fact that Fiora completely eclipses her once she does come back. On the other hand, you have Zanza, who does a great job being both a Deus and its stand-in. This guy's seriously menacing, and I wish he was more prevalent in the first half of the story. And man, I hate these cliffhangers in XPX. Not only is it extremely fucking shitty to pull a "the story never truly ends," but then to have actively contradict everything we've been told up this point and then never following up on it, that's just bullshit. Especially because the Black Knight is clearly a testament, but we'll get into this later. For XP2, I think that the core message of accepting grief as a common part of life is extremely noble and also fits the series very well. And the idea behind Rex as a protagonist is great. My main issue comes from how it's presented. It's a layer underneath so many anime tropes and so much poor comedy, and is held back by a slew of writers, none of whose style really meshes well with that of the others. The scene where Rex tells Nia that he loves her and everybody else is possibly one of the funniest scenes in the series, but it is so for all the wrong reasons. Let's talk about the Pneuma and Nia shit for a bit. I think Pneuma is a really interesting subversion of the antitype, since she is one to take the role of the split personality entity instead of the main character, but I absolutely hate how the ending makes Pyra and Mithra two separate entities. The way the cut dialogue for the ending reads to me is that originally they were going to reset both of them and keep Nia as the actual antitype, but for whatever reason they decided not to do that, which I find to be a decision for the worse. Nia in general is a character that needed much more spotlight. Instead they relegated her to what is essentially this game's Melia, though unlike Melia she actually got to bang the guy she likes. But man, those final few chapters of Blade 2 are so fucking good. The signs that Elysium is not really all it's made out to be are there from the start, but actually climbing the orbital elevator and reaching that deserted wasteland is far and away one of that game's best moments. And some of the character moments in the endgame are genuinely really strong. So why the fuck does it take the game so long to get there? And lastly, before we move on to connecting everything, let me complain about Blade 3's endgame for a bit, alright? Yes, the story really does end up suffering a lot towards the end, there's no denying that. Take the consoles for instance. They are literally just the testaments from Xenosaga, but because there are so many of them, only a small handful of them actually get to have any relevance whatsoever, with most of them serving as little more than cannon fodder for hero quests. And the heroes, man, none of them fucking matter. The game generally has this issue where it equates quality to quantity, when in actuality characters like the testaments only work because there were only a handful of them. And man, I just hate the power of friendship bullshit they pull in the final fight. Yes, it's cinematically really cool, but it's also extremely infuriating, because I know that the series can do better, it has in the past, and yet all of this is juxtaposed with some extremely heartfelt scenes throughout the first 5 chapters. Maybe it's because of my personal experiences making me biased, but that maternity ward scene was extremely heartwarming. And the scenes at the end of chapter 5 are some of the best we've had in the series since Saga. And that is saying a lot. But let's get back to what I said during the Blade 3 segment again, about how this is basically a legally distinct Gears reimagining. Having played one before the other immediately clues you in to a lot of the game's plot points, but whereas playing Blade 3 first leads to an awkward experience, playing Gears first lets you really appreciate what the game is actually going for. The imagery of an Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is something extremely prevalent throughout all of the franchise, but nowhere is it near as prominent as in Blade 3. It's symbolic of a self-destructive eternal cycle, and so I think making the story resemble that of Gears so closely was symbolic. Many people expected this to be the last game in the Perfect Work series, and I honestly cannot think of a way to cap it all off better than to have it all loop back around to the beginning. And then we add Future Redeemed into the equation, and everything just falls into place. It doesn't just finalize the cycle, it breaks it. From this point onward, everything is unclear. I have come to believe that everything that this series has ultimately built up to was planned ahead since, at the very least, the finalization of Xenoblade 2. And this leads us to the final section of this video series. The one where I frantically try to connect every single game in the franchise, try to make sense of everything we have seen so far, and finally attempt to create a cohesive timeline of everything. If you've still not played Gears, gone through all of Saga, and played all of Blade, and are for whatever reason still watching this video, then this is your last chance to drop out, because from this point onwards, we are going to explore what has been responsible for my steadily declining sanity these past 4 months. Dragon Ball Z. I still can't believe that I finally get to say this. I've been waiting for 4 months, but here goes nothing. I can't believe these games took place in Canada all along. Not only are Xenosaga, Xenoblade, and Xenoblade X canon, but by extension, Gears as well. I'll explain in a bit. This knowledge is what really allows us to recontextualize everything we know. So let's first run through the top before I try to make a timeline out of it. Let's start with Zanza. I believe that his role as a villain serves as an intentional inversion of Wilhelm. Whereas Wilhelm was trying to recreate the world in order to maintain some higher order, Klaus wanted to become its god. In turn, Alvis serves as Chaos's role in trying to break that cycle. And then we have the Fog Beasts and Future Redeemed. Since they're functionally identical, and we now know that Blade 1 and Blade 2 take place on Lost Jerusalem, it's fair to say that they are Gnosis. Xenoblade X is where the connections start to become loose, however. I think we can work around this though. So we know that the human database is essentially like the UMN, which is also what Origin uses as its base in Blade 3. But at the same time, X claims that wars with aliens were prevalent even before the destruction of the Earth. Saga, on the other hand, states that no alien life was ever discovered. Because of this, I'm willing to believe that the government in Blade X lied about a lot of things, including the aliens, and I also think that Mirror itself isn't a real planet. I think all of it is a fake reality instead of the UMN, where the data of all humans is endlessly repeated up until the moment of the database's destruction, which is how Lau ended up coming back. At the same time, the Black Knight is clearly a fucking testament, and since we know Wilhelm can freely fuck around with the UMN, it isn't far-fetched to think that he might have dispatched someone to check in on that simulated reality. And then there's Blade 3. I think the 3 original Möbius, X, Y, and Z are all based on the prior Xeno antagonists and represent a different form of the endless cycle throughout the series. X is Wilhelm and represents the idea of self-destruction and recreation from the point of origin. Y is Krelian and represents the idea of death and rebirth at the point of death. And lastly, Z is Zanza, who stands by the idea of keeping everything locked in a single eternal moment, similarly to how the Bionis and the Mechonis were locked in an eternal battle even after death. And then there's Future Redeemed, where all of this information is given to us, thanks to this fucking radio. We now know that, to some extent, Xenoblade X is canon, it must be. At the same time, we also know that Dmitry Yuriev has been around since the time of Lost Jerusalem, meaning that he's been jumping through bodies for far longer than we originally believed. And the entire fucking series took place in Canada. Toronto. Origin and the UMN are one and the same. Many people, myself included, believed for the longest time that Gears, Saga, Blade, and Blade X took place in 4 separate universes. But as it turns out, that's completely fucking wrong. That's why the characters in Torna can't be grouped into the archetypes properly. That's why Future Redeemed has multiple contexts. That's why the Trinity processor runs off of fucking Zohar emulators. There is so much overlap between every single game in the series that I cannot possibly list them all. Instead, I've linked the site in the description cataloging an insane amount of recurring imagery and themes throughout the franchise. Give it a read sometime. Maybe I'll even make a video on it. Some of these things are completely absurd, I'll admit, but a lot of it does ring true. With that said, let's get to making a cohesive timeline. We start off with Xenogears. Everything goes exactly as told in Perfect Works and the Saga 3 guides. The Zohar was discovered by T. Mazda in 20XX. In 2XXX, Grimoire Verum starts doing the first experiments in Toronto. Dmitry Yuriev is currently aligned with the Salvatore faction, and Wilhelm is already CEO of Vector. This is also when the first incarnation of Evil appears and makes contact with Nephilim. During one of the experiments, Nephilim vanishes. Around the same time, a different team of scientists led by Klaus also conduct their experiments on the Zohar aboard the first orbital space station. They do a phase transfer experiment and shit goes wrong. The Earth gets split in 2 and disappears. Abel disappears. The Salvatore faction uses their fleet to escape. At the same time, one of the fleets, the White Whale, also flees, but is somehow trapped in the phase transfer and ends up on an artificial planet inside of the UMN. We can assume that the entirety of Xenoblade X takes place at this point in time, with a big part of what everyone believes to have happened there being a bunch of bullshit made up by the government. In 2510, Transcended Christ was adopted, and in TC16, Earth was renamed to Lost Jerusalem, as Wilhelm seals its location away. Everything stays the same up until 4767. One must consider that Omega and Deus are one and the same. Something to note here is that in this timeline, the Eldritch is entirely man-made. Deus goes out of control, Abel reappears and becomes the original contact, becoming a full extension of Udu, aka the Wave Existence. The Eldritch crashes, and everything goes exactly as we see in Xenogears. The timeline takes its predetermined course, and Wilhelm calls upon the eternal recurrence. We don't know how many times his cycle is repeated, but judging from how Yeshua speaks, it's likely that it happened at the very least twice. On the X cycle, we reach the Saga version of events. Everything is the same, except that the Eldritch here is Abel's arc. After the disappearance of the Earth, the planet reappears as two split worlds, the world of the Bionis and Mechanis, and the destroyed remains of Canada. Klaus feels bad, so he turns it into Alrest by using the Zohar emulators of the Trinity processor as a base. After this, the events of the Blade series take place on Lost Jerusalem, first Torna. Sometime after this we reach TC 4667, and Pied Piper takes place. Then some 50 years after that, Blade 1 and Blade 2 take place, and then simultaneously, then Future Connected. An unspecified amount of time later, the worlds attempt to merge, Origin gets fucked over by Zed, and the Future Redeemed happens. Some years after this, we reach 4767 again, but this time there's a major difference. Yeshua decides to actually get involved once, and this changes the entire course of the timeline. All of Xenosaga until Missing Year happens. Then 6 months later, Xenoblade 3 and Saga 3 take place simultaneously. During the ending of Saga 3, Yeshua, Nephilim, and Mary destroy the UMN, and the seal on Lost Jerusalem. Because of the last few gates remaining, the worlds in Blade 3 finally merge as originally intended, and Earth is finally complete again. During this, KOS-MOS' broken body is guided by Yeshua towards the location of Lost Jerusalem, and shortly after its unification, she arrives, as we see in the post-credits to Future Redeemed. All of this played to a beautiful song composed by Mitsuda, with the same instruments he used all the way back in 1998 for Small Tube of Pieces, with Juan Hogg singing the lyrics written by Takahashi himself. And much like Maybe Tomorrow, it once again centers around the uncertainty of the future. However, this time it's different. This time it's not just the in-universe future that's uncertain, but the future of the entire franchise. Future Redeemed marks the end of Perfect Works as we know it. The series is no longer bound by the same structure it's been following since 1998. From here on, Team is free to do whatever the hell they want. Whatever comes next is completely uncharted territory. Maybe we'll see a war about the repopulation of Earth. Maybe the cast of Blade 3 end up meeting Shion and Junior, and maybe the remnants of the UMN have planned just one final surprise. I don't know, but you know what? I've never been more excited about being uncertain about the future, because to me, that's what Xeno is all about. It's a franchise where the core message has consistently been to move on from what's keeping us tied to the past, and for the longest time I was of the opinion that it is extremely ironic, after all, Tetsuya Takahashi seems to be incapable of doing so considering every game he makes ultimately just leads back to Xenogears, but I don't think that's entirely true anymore. If anything else, Future Redeemed has proved that even he is ready to move on, and it doesn't matter what comes next for the franchise. You can bet your ass that I'll be there to see it through, no matter what. And thus concludes my all-inclusive deep dive into the Xeno meta franchise. Across all of its ups and downs, I am ultimately very happy that I was able to follow this franchise in the way that I did, and I really don't think I can call it anything other than one of my all-time favorites, because I can confidently say that even at its worst, this series is able to make me get invested, even if just for a short while. So with all of that said, I thank all of you for watching these videos to the very end. Cheers, and do me a favor here, have a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night.